True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
On July 18th, 2014, 41-year-old law professor Dan Markel dropped off his two young sons at preschool, worked out at the gym, and returned home to his quiet Tallahassee, Florida home. This was a Friday, and Dan was looking forward to a relaxing weekend. But as soon as he pulled into his garage, someone shot him at point-blank range. Join us at the quiet end for Conspiracy, the Murder-for-Hire of Dan Markel. This is a story of a divorce and custody battle spun out of control and a family hell-bent on revenge. The investigation into Dan's murder went on for 2 years before two career criminals were arrested for driving 8 hours from Miami to stalk and kill Dan. They had no known connection to Dan, but Dan's ex-wife had family in the Miami area, and that family hated Dan, who was getting in the way of Wendi and her children moving closer to them. But were they capable of conspiring to have Dan killed? It was really difficult to believe that the Adelsons were behind a murder-for-hire plot, but no one else really had a clear motive to want Dan dead.
So our Florida beer is one I just had recently. We were visiting that beautiful state of Florida, and this is Florida Man, brewed by Cigar City Brewing in Tampa. This is a double IPA. So it's a hazy yellow with a small white head, a little bit of lace, aroma of citrus and pine, and a taste of grapefruit, lemon, and pine. This is light to medium bodied. And I gotta say, this is a nice enough beer, but it's not as good as a lot of their other beers. So.
But the name is super clever.
Well, of course.
Yeah, I like that. And you even bought a t-shirt.
Had to.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's open it up. I think it'll be refreshing enough.
Oh, yeah. You're not going to say, blah, this is terrible. You're just going to say, okay,
nice beer.
Enough.
Sure. All right, Dickie, come on down here to the quiet end. This is quite a case, a lot to go over, so I hope our listeners are patient with us today.
Yeah, this might take more than one sitting.
It might. There's just so much to talk about, and it really is fascinating to me, all the ins and outs and the psychology. So why don't you get us started?
Dan Markel was a high achiever from childhood. With supportive parents and an intelligent and curious mind, he would accomplish most of his goals. Dan's parents, Ruth and Phil, were raised in Montreal, Canada by European immigrants. They had met at a summer camp during college in 1963 and were married in 1966. The couple had a daughter, Shelley, in 1969, and Dan was born in 1972. Though Ruth and Phil had been raised in traditional kosher homes, they chose not to carry on the strict dietary rules with their children. Shabbat dinners on Friday evenings were important, but were sometimes skipped, do other things, or go on family trips. They didn't attend Saturday morning services at synagogue very often either. Instead, they chose to spend most of their weekends at their country cottage in Quebec's Laurentian Mountains. They did observe Judaism's most sacred high holy days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they attended a conservative synagogue, and they followed fasting rules. Jewish customs and rituals weren't a central facet of family life in the Markel house, but the relevance of Israel as a nation was. Ruth and Phil were strong believers in Israel's importance in Jewish history and culture, and they shared these values with their children. They had aunts and uncles in Israel, and cousins to Shelley and Dan who were relatively close in age. So each summer, the Markels would spend several weeks in Israel. It was a place Dan would grow to cherish more than any other place on earth.
He really did. So in 1978, the Markels moved from Montreal to Toronto. Shelley was 8 and Dan was 5. Ruth and Phil bought a suburban home and enrolled the kids in an Orthodox Hebrew day school. Now, during his childhood, Dan was into many, many activities. He played tennis, baseball, ice hockey, and he skied. He also enjoyed dancing and performing, actually getting the lead role in some school plays. He was very determined and was not someone who gave up easily. One example given by author Stephen B. Epstein in his book about the case, Extreme Punishment, was when Dan was 11. He got a job at a local bakery working after school and on the weekends, and one of his duties was to tie a red string around the pastry boxes as the orders were being filled, but he couldn't make the bow properly. So his boss told him they'd have to let him go if he couldn't figure it out. Dan took home dozens of boxes one night and practiced for hours until he was pretty much an expert at bow tying, and he was able to keep his job. So he was determined.
He was.
Dan was also an expert at Trivial Pursuit as a child. He almost always won because he memorized every question and answer on the cards. But it was in Hebrew school that Dan developed his love of the Jewish religion. It really gave him a sense of belonging. He liked going to the religious services so much that when his parents couldn't get him there on time, he'd take the city bus. And he did this when he was just 8 years old.
Now, the Markel family moved again in 1986, just before Dan's 14th birthday. His mother, Ruth, had published a book, Room at the Top, A Woman's Guide to Moving Up in Business. His mom was then hired as a speaker and management consultant. Now, this meant she had to travel to downtown Toronto, which is about 90 minutes from the family's home. Her commute caused her to miss out on family time, so she and Phil decided to relocate closer to downtown.
So these people are impressive, and just reading through this stuff, I felt very inadequate. Just as an aside.
Achievers, that's for sure.
Absolutely. All of them were.
Dan was enrolled in the Forest Hill Collegiate Institute, which was a public high school. In high school, one of Ruth's friends, who worked as a guidance counselor, helped Dan map out a plan, including everything he needed to do and accomplish to be considered by Ivy League colleges like Harvard. Now, Harvard was Dan's dream school. Of course, he needed excellent grades, but that was never a problem for him. The guidance counselor also advised Dan to become active in student organizations, so he joined the debate team. He started a club for environmental conservation, and he revived the dead student newspaper, becoming both its editor and business manager. He even signed up local businesses to run ads.
Yeah, when he was 16, Dan spent the summer in Israel all on his own, and the following summer he was at Tufts University just outside of Boston in a pre-college program. That was his first long stay in the United States. His last summer before college, he was overseas again at the University of Cambridge in England, when a childhood friend and sometime girlfriend of his died in a bombing in Tel Aviv. Dan spoke at her funeral. When he spoke, he asked, "Why do bad things happen to good people?" And he started to question his faith in a just moral order. So Dan went through a period of sadness after this friend's death, but then he was thrilled when he learned he'd been accepted at Harvard. In September of 1991, Dan arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he really fell in love with this Ivy League school. He quickly made friends and joined student organizations. Dan loved to discuss his views of the world with people from all backgrounds, and his ideas were usually quite liberal, but he enjoyed discussing them with classmates who were more conservative. He was just an excellent debater, but he was also a good listener. He could seem abrasive to new people, but his friends found him to be very affectionate and kind, always greeting them with an excited smile and a hug. So by his senior year at Harvard, Dan had become associate editorial chair of the school paper The Crimson. It was the only daily paper in Cambridge. He and other editors would prepare staff editorials representing the opinion of the paper. 40 to 50 of the senior level staff got together each Sunday evening where they discussed editorials for the week ahead, and the group debated and worked together on their arguments. These sessions were excellent practice for his eventual career in academia. Dan graduated magna cum laude with a BA in government.
Then after he graduated, Dan spent 10 months in Israel. Then he completed his master's degree in philosophy at the University of Cambridge, and from there he went on to Harvard Law. By the time he graduated Harvard Law in May 2001, Dan was probably the only aspiring law professor in the country to have had 3 articles accepted for publication. Dan wanted to become a law professor. Now, graduates hoping to become law professors often follow their legal education by clerking for federal judges. And out of these, a select few might even clerk for the Supreme Court of the United States. Although Dan never became a SCOTUS clerk, he did a clerkship at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit.
Yeah, at this time, Dan's sister was married and had 2 children. And Dan, who always saw himself as a husband and a father sometime in his future, wanted to find the woman who would become his wife. And he did find many dates on JDate, which is a Match.com type of site for Jewish singles. And that's where he did find his future wife, Wendi Adelson. So Wendi was the 3rd child of Harvey and Donna Adelson, and she was their only daughter. She was born in 1979 after the family moved from New York to Coral Springs in southern Florida. Her dad, Harvey, opened a thriving dental practice, the Adelson Institute, and the family moved into a 5-bedroom, 5,000-square-foot house with a pool. Donna then was able to give up her career as a school teacher when she became a mother. As a very doting mother, she made sure that her children received intellectual stimulation at home, and by the time they began elementary school, all 3 of her children, Rob, Charlie, and Wendi, were academically ahead of their peers. Now, much like Dan, Wendi excelled in school. She was valedictorian of her 1997 graduating class, and she earned several awards and scholarships. Donna was super proud of her daughter's academic accomplishments, but she was just as proud that Wendi had made it through high school as a virgin. So that's kind of weird.
Well, how does she know?
Well, they're very close, Dickie, kind of weirdly close. So you'll find out.
She sits her daughter down and says, "So tell me you're still a virgin?"
I don't know how it went exactly, but she kept an eye on these things, apparently.
Okay.
A little bit involved, as I'm saying.
Just a bit.
Just a bit. So Wendi got her undergraduate degree at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, which was just a few miles away from Boston. Students, many of them Jewish, arrived on campus from all across the country. Because so many of them kept kosher, the main dining hall included a separate serving line following kosher requirements.
Now, Wendi had entered college expecting to go on to medical school, like her oldest brother Rob, but she eventually decided on working with immigrant children. She interned with the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, D.C., and volunteered as a conflict resolution teacher at a girls' juvenile detention center. After graduating from Brandeis in 2001, Wendi returned to Washington, D.C. She earned another scholarship, which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that provided for a full ride for a Master's in Philosophy program at the University of Cambridge.
So you can see they kind of had a lot in common.
Sure have.
Yeah, they're 7 years apart, but they did a lot of similar things.
So she went to England to begin her graduate studies, where she focused on international relations, which included the immigration issues facing the UK.
Wendi's brother Charlie, the middle child, followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a dentist. But Charlie really enjoyed being single and really had no desire to get married or have a family. After his 3-year surgical residency, Charlie became a specialist in periodontics, extractions, implants, and bone grafts, and they renamed the dental practice Adelson Institute for Aesthetics and Implant Dentistry, and they earned a lot of income from these additional services.
Oh yeah, they are costly.
That is a lot of money, and because of that, the practice made a lot more money than it had. In 2012, Harvey allowed his periodontist son, Charlie, to become the owner of the practice, and he just worked there part-time.
The oldest Adelson son, Rob, went to medical school at the University of South Florida. Now, he couldn't have been more different from his money-focused weightlifting brother. One issue for Rob was that he fell in love with an Indian medical resident. Donna and Harvey were very opposed to the match and did everything they could to stop Rob from marrying her. Rob ended up marrying a Jewish woman, like his folks wanted, but he had the marriage annulled shortly after the wedding, and went back to the love of his life.
So can you imagine the kind of pressure if he actually went through with marrying someone else when he's in love with this woman? So I just want you to get some idea of the pressure, of the kind of weird overbearingness in this family.
Eventually, Donna and Harvey did accept Rob's wife. Rob and his wife settled across the country in Albany, New York, where they happily raised 2 mixed-race Gentile children.
Yeah, so they did accept his wife, and they were at the wedding, and everything went well, but it just wasn't the same as it was with the other 2 children who stayed in Florida. Rob really kind of had to get away, I get the feeling, and he could get along with them from across the country.
Yeah, but he did get out of their clutches.
He did. Now,
and he did follow his own heart, I guess. He had acquiesced with his folks, but then he annulled the marriage and went back to his first love.
He did.
I say good for him.
Yes, and he would say that marrying that other woman was the biggest mistake he ever had, but he just felt so much pressure to please his parents. But I'm glad that he was able to end up with the woman that he loved. And they seem like they have a happy life. So Donna and Harvey were really thrilled when Wendi returned to Florida to go to law school. She attended the University of Miami with a full scholarship, and she was able to spend most weekends in Coral Springs with her parents. Wendi signed up for J-Date, and that was when her mother insisted that the time had come for 25-year-old Wendi to find her Mr. Right. So Donna seems like she's even more involved in her daughter's life than in her son's lives.
Well, mother-daughter.
So one Saturday afternoon, Wendi was looking through eligible bachelors on the website with her mom standing behind her, watching over her shoulder. Dozens of men from South Florida were popping up on the screen, but none of them met their standards. Since Wendi planned to begin her career as an immigration lawyer in Washington, D.C., she expanded her search to include men in her age range living in or near D.C. When Wendi was about ready to give up, Donna excitedly pointed to a profile on the computer screen. And there was a photo of a handsome 31-year-old Harvard-educated lawyer. He had a really nice smile, a handsome face, and he wore glasses. His profile satisfied all of their criteria, and then some. And this was Dan Markel.
Pretty soon, Dan found a message from Wendi in his J-Date inbox. She had written that she liked his profile, and 3 things caught his attention when he looked at her profile. First, she was very attractive, with turquoise blue eyes and a beautiful smile. Second, she was young, just 25, and that's 6 years younger than Dan. Third, she lived in Miami. That was over 1,000 miles away, but she seemed worthy of some further exploration. So they got to know each other online and found that they had a lot in common. Though they'd grown up over 2,000 miles apart, they had attended colleges within 10 miles of one another. Wendi had been at Brandeis during the same years that Dan had been at law school at Harvard, and their paths following college were similar as well. They had both pursued master's studies at the University of Cambridge and then went on to law school. Wendi had even lived in D.C. during her fellowship. So on paper anyway, these 2 seemed made for each other. So they arranged to meet in person that September, while Wendi was in Washington interviewing for her summer clerkship.
Yeah, it must have gone well because after meeting, Dan and Wendi began a long-distance relationship. Dan would say he felt a strong physical attraction to his new girlfriend, but he fell in love with Wendi more because of her intellect and sense of humor. He also admired her passion to commit her life to public service. And Wendi, too, felt a physical connection with Dan. He had a playful side she enjoyed, and he seemed to have a really big heart. He was also far more worldly than any man she'd dated before. And Dan was just brilliant. He checked every box on her list for a future husband and future father of her children. So while Wendi was still in her second year of law school at the University of Miami, planning to become an immigration attorney, she and Dan discussed the idea of her completing law school wherever Dan got a teaching job. To Dan's disappointment, UC Berkeley didn't give him an offer. His most attractive offer came from Florida State, whose faculty saw a lot of potential in this Harvard graduate. If Dan wanted to avoid another year's wait, a move to Tallahassee, Florida was his best choice. Now, he kind of had to swallow his pride when he accepted Florida State's invitation for a visit. He'd kind of had higher expectations.
Well, that's a good point. Here's a guy with an impeccable academic resume.
Yes.
Harvard Law, Masters at Cambridge. He should be going someplace big.
Yeah, but I guess it is really, really competitive. We'll go over a little bit of that.
It must have been.
It has to be. If he couldn't get anything he wanted, you would think he would be a shoo-in.
Yeah.
But some of it was also his personality maybe a little bit too, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, that was an interesting point brought up.
So he decided, he'd give Tallahassee a try. Maybe it would be like a stepping stone, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can start out here, really shine, and then move on to a place that I want to be at.
Yeah, and even though Wendi was not near Tallahassee, she was in Florida. So it's closer than D.C. to her. So he and Wendi decided to go to Tallahassee and see the culture, visit some synagogues and schools, and look at housing options. Because at the time, neither one of them knew much about Florida's capital city, Tallahassee. What they learned during their visit was kind of discouraging. I mean, Tallahassee was nothing like Boston, D.C., or even Miami. It was small, with just over 4,000 Jews among its 150,000 residents. Its cultural scene and public school system were mediocre at best, and the Florida State campus was surrounded by dilapidated, crime-ridden neighborhoods that were unsafe to be in after dark. But for the sake of Dan's career, Wendi agreed to move there, and the plan was they'd move elsewhere as soon as they could.
There's a plan.
So they seem agreeable, like they're getting along.
Yeah.
Making decisions together and looking at a future.
They are. In May 2005, Dan took Wendi with him to visit Israel. She'd never been there before. While they were there, Dan proposed, and Wendi accepted. Wow, did I win the lottery of life, Dan wrote his friends to share the good news. Couple's friends and family members were happy for them. But then after they returned to the United States, there were some big issues.
Yeah, and here we'll get into a little bit about the personality issues. Wendi had spent that summer in D.C. clerking for a big law firm so she could be with Dan as much as possible before they moved to Tallahassee. One evening, she introduced Dan to a friend of hers from law school. Now, the discussion between these two men moved to the subject of affirmative action, and for some reason, Dan began posing hypotheticals, as if he were teaching a law school class, trying to point out the flaws in Wendi's friend's position. So this upset Wendi. She was mortified. This was her new fiancé, and he was being very rude to her friend, in her opinion. Now, she'd seen Dan make some social missteps before, but she'd never seen him like this. She was embarrassed, and she apologized for his behavior. And then she was really angry with Dan. His behavior made her doubt whether she could love a man who treated people the way Dan had treated her friend. So she told Dan she needed a break. She needed to spend a few days apart. Then she told her closest friends that she was thinking of canceling the engagement. So Dan was really upset about this. He was in love with her by then, and he would not give up on the relationship. He actually spent the rest of that summer working to win Wendi back. And she finally did forgive him, and they went ahead with their plans to move to Tallahassee and get married.
Obviously, we weren't there for that argument, but
right.
If it's as it's described, that would certainly raise some red flags.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the only instance that I've read or heard about where he could be kind of difficult. He was brilliant, for sure, and sometimes he seemed just a little bit arrogant and patronizing.
Yeah, I get that impression.
And maybe he didn't mean it to be that way, but people certainly did take it that way.
But it came across that way.
Yes, and I would think if this upset her that much, maybe she shouldn't have married him. But he was wanting her to come back, and he worked on that.
Yeah, and she said, okay, let's do it.
Yeah, but she really wasn't happy in Tallahassee, which was not a surprise.
No, that wouldn't be a surprise.
No.
So Dan looked into positions at more prestigious law schools in more Jewish-oriented cities, expressing interest in even a lateral move. He did approach the University of Miami about a possible position there, even though its law school wasn't more highly regarded than Florida State's. At that point in his life, Dan would have done just about anything to make Wendi happy, including teaching at a mediocre law school so Wendi could be near her family.
Yeah, now back in Coral Springs, Donna Adelson was busy planning her daughter's wedding. At Dan's request, he and his bride would be reciting their vows at a conservative synagogue in Boca Raton. Dan had another request which he considered extremely important. The menu needed to be strictly kosher. It wasn't just for him. Many of his friends and family who'd be attending the wedding kept kosher, including his rabbi friends. Wendi's parents, though, were against a kosher wedding. No one in their family kept kosher, so they thought that Dan's request was very selfish. So for weeks this was an issue and it went unresolved. But then suddenly, Donna relented, and she told Dan that his happiness was more important than the food their guests would be served. So we think it's all settled then.
Yes, we do. So their wedding was on February 26, 2006. Nearly 200 people were in attendance. And at Dan's request, the ceremony was officiated by Rabbi Robinson, his old Cambridge friend who had become the senior rabbi of an Orthodox shul in New York. Now, when Rabbi Robinson walked into the synagogue's kitchen to check in with the kosher supervisor, he was surprised not to find one. Catering staff told him that a last-minute change in the menu had been requested by the bride's family, so the food being served wouldn't be kosher after all.
Yikes. This is really a big deal.
It's like a hand grenade thrown into the wedding. And
it is.
At the very last minute.
Yes.
You know, what are you going to do?
And he's invited so many people who kept kosher, and it was important to him. So this is really a slap in the face, and the rabbi didn't want to get Dan upset. Now, he wasn't going to leave Dan without an officiant, but he couldn't be around non-kosher food. So the rabbi decided to keep what he'd learned quiet until after the ceremony so that Dan could enjoy his wedding ceremony at least. But then just before the ceremony began, the caterers wheeled out food that included chopped liver and cheese, which Dan noticed. Now, being kosher, explain that to me again. You can't have dairy and meat together.
Yeah, there's certain things that need to be separate.
Uh-huh.
So, as this example, chopped liver is the meat.
Right.
And dairy is the cheese. You can't serve those together.
And there's something about the animals being killed a certain way as well.
Right.
I thought a rabbi had to be there for it.
Oh, to be kosher, sure.
Yeah. Okay. But those are the biggies.
Yeah.
As far as we know. Those are the big things.
Oh, and you cook separately, too. So you can't cook liver in a frying pan and then put dairy in the same pan. There's cooking implements for dairy and there's cooking implements for non-dairy.
So you can't ever have a cheeseburger then?
Nope.
But you could have a veggie burger with cheese.
You could have a veggie burger with a slice of cheese on it.
Okay. So Dan noticed this food being wheeled out. And the rabbi reassured him, don't worry, it was just a mistake, trying to keep things cool. He did his best to keep Dan calm as the guests took their seats, but Dan was now really confused and upset. Still, he made the most of it and he smiled and he got through the wedding service. As the crowd moved into the ballroom for the reception, the rabbi then pulled Dan aside and let him know that he just couldn't stay for dinner. Dan understood and he apologized to his friend who'd flown all the way in from New York and wouldn't be there for dinner and dancing because of this. So Dan called a taxi to take the rabbi to a kosher restaurant, and then he went back to the reception. But he felt really shaken and he felt betrayed by his new in-laws. So what he had to do is he had to go from table to table, telling his friends and family members who kept kosher not to eat the food. He was very upset that his mother-in-law had deceived him and humiliated him over something she knew he had considered very important. So this was a very bad start to Dan's relationship with his in-laws.
That's putting it mildly.
Yes.
This would be kind of the ultimate slap in your face.
Well, yeah, it's not as if they didn't discuss it. It had been a big topic, and she had acquiesced.
She knew how important it was to him.
She certainly did.
And she went ahead and unilaterally changed it.
Yeah, and it seems that Wendi took her side.
Well, that's not a surprise.
Well, no, not as we get through this. Now, after a temporary position at Law in Miami, which didn't turn into a permanent position, Dan returned to Florida State for the spring semester. The dean there was actually so happy to have him there that he gave Dan a raise. And to ease this blow to Wendi and her family, Dan encouraged Wendi to stay in Miami to complete her academic year. So she did that, extending their long-distance relationship for another semester. Now, once the couple realized that Florida State would probably be more than just some short stepping stone in his career, Dan and Wendi bought a house in one of Tallahassee's older neighborhoods, Benton Hills. Their new home was just a 10-minute drive from the law school, which was right across the street from Wendi's new office at the Center for Advancement of Human Rights. Now, this is where Dan had secured her a full-time job as part of a package deal. Now, Florida State just saw Dan as this big star, and they would do just about anything they could to keep him. And Wendi, in her own right, was a well-educated woman. So they gave her a job there as well, trying to keep Dan happy. In their new home, Wendi reluctantly agreed that they could keep strictly kosher, with separate dishes and different cabinets for meat and for dairy. She also agreed to Dan's idea to host weekly Shabbat dinners. So Dan was in charge of grocery shopping to ensure that kosher rules were adhered to. And despite some setbacks, they were in love and they showed each other a lot of affection.
When Wendi turned 30, she was nearly 6 months pregnant. Benjamin Markel was born in July 2009. Donna was the first family member besides the baby's parents to hold Benjamin. And from what I've learned about Donna, that's not a surprise.
No, she's really the overbearing mother, isn't she?
She sure sounds like it.
Yes.
So she, Harvey, and Charlie were in town for the birth. Harvey and Charlie returned to Coral Springs to keep the practice running, and Donna stayed at the Tallahassee house for 6 weeks to help Wendi with the baby. And just 1 year later, Wendi gave birth to their second son. This is October 2010. And again, Donna came in to stay and help with the baby for 6 weeks.
So Florida State's law school was on the rise in prestige, in part due to Dan's prominence as a punishment theory scholar. Nearly 4 years into his job at Florida State, Dan no longer wanted to leave for something better. The town had actually grown on him. He'd made friendships and he felt really invested in the local community, especially its Jewish population. But Wendi's career was not going as well as her husband's. Even though she worked just steps away from the law school, her position as a public interest attorney and adjunct professor wasn't under the law school's umbrella. So her $35,000 salary was funded by a grant from the Florida Bar Foundation, and it had to be renewed annually, so she really didn't have job security. Still, Wendi was writing opinions and briefs which were published, but what she really wanted to do was tell her clients' stories in a way that would be accessible to ordinary people and not just academics. So the result, which took her 2 years, was a 276-page work of fiction that she titled This Is Our Story.
For almost 2 years, Wendi was reaching out to agents and publishers. After multiple rejections, she ended up self-publishing on Amazon. Dan promoted her book signings, but he never read the book himself. Now, there's some explanation for this, which doesn't sound real reasonable, but anyway, Dan didn't read novels, and he probably thought it was beneath him in some ways.
Yeah, I think that was the overwhelming thing, is it was just not anything that he felt he needed to read. It was beneath him. He wasn't interested in it.
Yeah.
He was that way.
This is just trash stuff, and I'm not going to waste my time doing it.
Basically, and understandably, this bothered Wendi. It really did show a lack of respect for her. She didn't understand it.
I don't either.
Well, no, I mean, it's not nice, but...
It's 275 pages. You can read the fucker. Jeez.
Well, in his defense, it was kind of horrible, I've heard. But on the other hand, it's his wife, and yes, he should have read it. If he was interested in keeping his relationship happy, he should have read it. But he didn't.
Right, so we won't dwell on that.
But maybe if he had, he might have seen some real clues, because the novel turned out to be autobiographical in many ways. Now, for example, the female character Lily hates her adopted town of Hiawassee Springs. So that's a fictional town. Sounds a little bit like Tallahassee. It was easy to see the similarities between Wendi's book and Wendi's life. In this novel, Lily gives up a thriving corporate DC law practice to follow her husband to the fictional Hiawassee Springs and work at the made-up North Florida State University. So she wasn't very good at making these fictional places different from real life. It's very close.
Kind of transparent.
And at North Florida State University, Lily's husband, Josh, was a law professor. The chapters about Lily are notable for the character's growing contempt for her husband as well. The Lily character feared that she had been trapped in a bad marriage. Now, it was well known that Wendi hated Tallahassee and she wanted to live in Miami, where her experience with immigration law would be more relevant. But also Wendi was just unhappy with Dan and the marriage overall.
Yeah, I mean, according to Wendi, nothing much was going right for her.
Yeah, which I don't see that it was all that bad, honestly.
No,
but she wasn't happy.
She wasn't. I'm going to say it looks to me like she was felt undervalued.
Yes, I think that's probably true.
He's teaching law. He's a big shot. She's practicing laws and making $30,000 a year.
Exactly, but I think if you're married to someone, you shouldn't be competitive, although she was. And
yeah.
Okay, I mean, that's her choice to be competitive with her husband, but I don't see the point of it. They should be working together, and his successes should be her successes and vice versa in my mind.
Right.
But it wasn't that way. And, I don't think Dan was the most considerate guy. He was busy. He was, going to conferences, teaching classes, talking with other intellectuals. He didn't have a lot of time for her, although everyone said he was really a great dad and that he did love her.
In his way.
In his way, sure. Now, another point of contention in the marriage was how seriously Dan took his Jewish identity. He kept a strict kosher home and saw himself as a Kohen. Jewish law forbids a Kohen from having contact with corpses, other than those of close family members. So this means that a Kohen might avoid entering a cemetery or attending a funeral unless it's for a close relative like mother, father, sister, brother, son, daughter, or spouse. But Wendi did not accept this. When her grandmother died, Dan told her that he'd go to the memorial, but he couldn't go to the grave site. And Wendi and her family were very offended by this.
Yeah, well, I could see where they'd be a little irked. And this is a grandmother. I mean, it's not his close relative, but it is a relative by marriage.
Yes, but you heard what I said about relatives.
Yeah.
Immediate family.
Immediate family.
And that was his decision to do that. And, I just think at this point, the family's getting more and more turned off with him.
Yeah. So in late summer of 2012, Dan and Wendi, along with their friends Tracy Cohen and Courtney McMahon, and their husbands, went on a beach trip to St. George Island in the Gulf of Mexico. This is about a 90-minute drive from Tallahassee. And as they were unloading their cars in the parking lot, Wendi pulled the other two women aside and swore them to secrecy. She told the women that she had finalized her plans to leave Dan. She was doing it when he next left town. Now, Dan's just a few feet away from them, joking and putting their sons in a double-wide stroller. And he had no idea that the women were discussing how his marriage would be ending in just a matter of weeks.
Yeah, so this is just very sneaky, which I don't understand why it had to be so sneaky. It's not like he was an abusive person that you needed to run away from. But it seems like she and her family had talked about this for quite a while. So on Monday, September 12, 2012, several criminal law professors were seated at a conference room table at the NYU Law School in Greenwich Village. Most lived in New York, but Dan had flown into the city for this. Their workshopping sessions would last for hours, focusing on just 2 papers each afternoon. And Dan's paper was scheduled for discussion the next day. As the professors were offering insights on one of his colleagues' drafts, Dan's cell phone vibrated, and he saw Wendi's name on the screen. Now, over the past 3 days he'd been in New York, she hadn't answered his calls, voicemails, or texts. So he knew something was wrong, but he had no idea how upset she really was. So Dan excused himself from the meeting to take a call. And as soon as he said hello, Wendi said, "I'm leaving and taking the boys with me. I'm filing for divorce." So this just kind of floored him. Dan said, "Please don't do that. Let me come home first and we'll talk. I'll be on the first flight back. Please don't do anything rash until I get there." But Wendi just hung up on him, and he felt blindsided. When he re-entered the conference room, he was as white as a sheet. He picked up his laptop and papers and politely excused himself.
Meanwhile, back in Tallahassee, everything was going like Wendi had planned. Donna and Harvey Adelson had been there all weekend, helping to execute the plan they and Wendi had come up with early that summer. Professional movers loaded furniture into the truck, while Wendi's friends helped her pack up the kids' clothing and toys. Just 3 and almost 2 years old, Ben and Lincoln were oblivious to what was happening to their lives. Now, Dan didn't know it, but the boys had been living in a new home since he had left on Friday.
So I really don't understand why this was done this way. Do you?
My only guess is that it's a power play.
Yeah.
And just to say, we're going to be playing hardball here.
Yeah, but to Dan, it seemed kind of out of the blue. And why were Harvey and Donna so into this? They just didn't like him anymore either, I guess.
Well, I don't think they ever really liked him.
Well, Donna's the one that picked him out on the screen on J-Date.
Oh, that's not liking or disliking. That's just saying, that's a good one.
Yeah, okay. So during his 2.5-hour flight back to Tallahassee that evening, Dan was really trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. Now, Wendi had been telling him that she was unhappy, telling him that he was disengaged from her, that he was traveling way too much, and focusing on his career to the exclusion of her and the children. And I'm sure there was some truth to that. But as far as Dan was concerned, things were still mostly good, and there was no reason to just separate all of a sudden. So when Dan finally pulled his car into his garage, the seriousness of this situation hit him. The shelving and everything that had been in the garage was gone. His bicycle, luggage, tennis racket, and all of the kids' toys were missing. Dan went into the house through the garage side door and saw that half of the living room furniture was gone, leaving empty spots where chairs and couches had been. The dining room table was still there, but half of the chairs had been taken. Dishes and silverware and most of the food from the pantry and refrigerator were gone. So Dan walked upstairs, and he saw that the guest bedroom had nothing in it at all. And the boys' room was empty except for a crib mattress that had been tossed on the floor. Dan went downstairs to the master bedroom, and to his surprise, the bed was still there. But centered on the comforter was a 10-page divorce petition. It had a stamp showing that it had been filed at 4 p.m. that afternoon, just after Wendi had called him in New York. It read that the marriage between the parties is irretrievably broken. Wendi was asking the court to adopt a parenting plan that provides wife with the majority of time sharing. She was also seeking child support, alimony, and an equitable distribution of their property.
As Dan studied the petition, he noticed that Wendi had actually signed it on September 5th, which was before he'd even left for New York.
Yeah, this had been in the works.
I sure had. And though the divorce petition had been placed where he'd see it, Wendi hadn't left a note or forwarding address for him. Dan had no idea where she and the boys were. He texted and called, and she didn't respond. And he's understandably sad, angry, and afraid. Dan's parents were already scheduled to visit that week for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Now, what was supposed to be a holiday celebration would be a desperate effort to locate Ben and Lincoln.
Well, if he'd read Wendi's novel, Dan would have recognized the similarities between himself and Josh, and Wendi and Lily. Wendi had used actual moments in their lives together in this book. Dan would have seen a preview of where his own marriage was heading if he'd read it. The fictional marriage between Lily and Josh ultimately did end in divorce. Dan had been too absorbed in his career to credit Wendi's creative writing as worthy, though, and he would never waste his time reading novels. Wendi had first told him that she wanted a divorce back in 2011, when their younger boy Lincoln was a baby. But Dan's reaction at that time was to tell her she was welcome to leave, but that he'd be the one to keep the house and the kids. So they ended up in counseling, but their sessions had stopped after just only a short time. In Wendy's opinion, the counseling hadn't addressed any of their real problems, and she'd confided to her friends that she'd fallen in love with the wrong man. She said she felt devalued by him, explaining that he never treated her as an equal.
Dan did finally get hold of Wendi the day after he returned from New York, and he told her that he'd be filing kidnapping charges unless she let him see the kids. So they met for an ice cream, and he could see for himself that the boys were still in town and were okay. Wendi had their mutual friends, Alan and Lynn Grossman, come with her, and then when his parents arrived for the Jewish holidays, Wendi allowed the kids to spend a few days with them.
Yeah, so it was looking like maybe it would work out. But then Dan did learn that Wendi had been planning to leave him for months. In Florida, a parent isn't permitted to file for divorce until completing a parenting course that's approved by the state. And Dan learned that Wendi had taken and completed hers in July, so a couple months before she left him. And what really infuriated him more than anything was Wendy's refusal to let him know where she and the kids were staying. That just didn't seem right. Every chance he had, he'd tell his family and friends how cruel it was for Wendi not to tell him. And the only place he knew he could see his sons without any interference was at their preschool. So he started going there every school day for breakfast or lunch, just to see them.
He couldn't stand this. In September, Dan went to Wendy's office at the law school and demanded that she tell him where the boys were living. He threatened to contact the police and push for federal kidnapping charges against her if she refused. So she finally agreed, and things settled down again, at least temporarily.
Yeah, and then in October, Dan had his 40th birthday. He had a small little party at his house, which was very toned down. Dan was so sad about losing his family, and that's about all he could talk about. He even cried. Wendy's leaving while he was out of town and then planning the whole thing behind his back was labeled by Dan as his Pearl Harbor moment. Dan sent out an email to his closest friends that evening, writing that his family was reconfiguring and explaining what Wendi had done. But the email wasn't all negative. He wrote about how his promotion at the college was looking good and how he was trying his best to adapt and raise the boys. Then he ended his email with, "Everything wonderful is also and already fragile. Love mightily while you can."
And as angry as he was with Wendi, Dan still wanted to reconcile with her. He sent her emails, and he outlined the changes he was willing to make and his commitment to healing their relationship. He had flowers delivered to her office and even ended up begging her to give him another chance. But days would go by without a response to his emails, and that's if she responded at all. So Wendi was clearly done with this marriage, but it certainly was taking Dan a long time to figure that out.
Well, when he did finally accept it, he did hire a local divorce attorney, Thomas Duggar. Dan felt certain it was only a matter of time before Wendi would push to move to South Florida with the boys. He was aware that since their separation, Wendy's mother Donna had been spending time in Tallahassee helping Wendi with the boys. And he knew that he'd be fighting the entire Adelson family in a custody battle. Moving the boys to South Florida would definitely become Donna and Harvey's mission in life. Wendy's parents and her brother Charlie would be willing to spend as much money as necessary to get his sons in southern Florida permanently, and to Dan that was completely unacceptable.
And by late November, Wendi had secured a job at a personal injury law firm in South Florida. Her divorce attorney filed Wendy's petition to relocate in January 2013, with an email confirming her job offer with a salary of $115,000 per year. The petition read that Wendi would begin living at her childhood home in Coral Springs on May 1st, when her new job was scheduled to begin. And according to the petition, the move would provide a better quality of life for the children by increasing their access to close family and providing more stability and consistency.
Well, the petition stated that Dan really had no intention of staying in Tallahassee and that he'd been trying to climb the academic ladder. With teaching responsibilities just twice a week, the petition said, Dan could easily commute back and forth to South Florida. Now we're talking at least 6 hours one way.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you just put your pencil down and go from Tallahassee to Miami.
No, it's quite a ways. And then she also said that Dan had health issues that made him unable to care for the children on his own. This included Crohn's disease and a back problem that had required surgery back in 2012. Now, for 5 weeks, Dan put all of his efforts into his response to Wendy's relocation petition. He criticized Wendy's economic reasons for her proposed move, saying that the job with friends of her parents was set up just so she could get custody. She'd never worked for a private law firm before, and the law school had just promoted her to clinical professor with a salary of $100,000 a year. So he also made note of the fact that the boys had lived their entire lives in Tallahassee, and they had some really strong connections with about 50 other families there. Dan also criticized Wendi for using their children as pawns. He asserted that she couldn't be trusted to follow through with her commitments on custody sharing if she and the kids moved to South Florida. He pointed out her repeated failures to let the boys Skype with him on many occasions. And he also complained that she'd done nothing to facilitate the children's connection to the Jewish community, because that was important to him and not to her. She wouldn't even let him take them to synagogue during her weekends. So Dan wrote, "Wife really cannot be trusted to consider the children's best interests or the husband's reasonable parenting interests." Now, of course, Dan's in-laws were furious after they read Dan's attacks on Wendi. They were determined to win at all costs. And Donna told Wendi, "The most important part of your divorce is relocation. I sincerely hope your attorney understands that this is your non-negotiable." Donna wanted to make sure that Wendy's attorney understood the sacrifices that she and Harvey had been making, traveling to Tallahassee for extended periods to take care of their grandchildren. Donna also wanted the judge to get the message that Dan was just a big bully. She told Wendi to gather up some of his emails to prove this point. She also thought the judge should know that her son-in-law was a religious zealot who was indoctrinating the kids into Judaism. Donna encouraged Wendi to say whatever was necessary to get Dan to cooperate with her move. Donna even went so far as to suggest a bribe to get Dan to allow for Wendy's relocation, and she informed Wendi that she was on anti-anxiety medications since the custody issues had come up. Just thinking about her worthless son-in-law, Donna said, and the way he was treating her precious daughter, was more than she could stand.
The relocation hearing was held on June 18, 2013. Dan and his attorney were seated at one counsel table, while Wendi and her attorney were at another. Wendi testified for 3 hours, outlining the many reasons why she wanted to move to South Florida with the boys. The judge said that she was unimpressed with Wendy's case for relocation, and after reading the court filings and listening to Wendy's testimony, she couldn't find any basis to move the children across the state. The desire to be with extended family members, the judge said, should never override the rights and needs of two loving parents. She told Wendy's lawyer that she couldn't stop her from sharing additional evidence, but she believed doing so would be a waste of time and energy. So, and after discussing this with Wendi, her attorney agreed there'd be no further evidence presented. The judge denied Wendy's petition and ordered her and Dan to participate in mediation prior to their 3-day trial, which was to begin July 31st.
Yeah, so Dan called his mom before leaving the courthouse that day, telling her about the judge's decision. He was so relieved. As Wendi left the courthouse with her mom, Donna, the two were just obviously seething. So Donna put together a 5-step plan of action to defeat Dan, and this was centered on convincing him that Wendi would be raising Ben and Lincoln in the Catholic faith. The first step was for Wendi to take a photo of the boys standing at the front door of a Tallahassee church, and then make it her Facebook profile picture so everyone would see it. Step 2 involved a private tutor to come to Wendy's house and teach the boys all about Jesus. Donna offered to arrange for the tutor if Wendi didn't have time. Third in Donna's plan was for Wendi to tell Dan that his children were being baptized in the Catholic Church. Donna told Wendi that she'd already checked this out and a baptism could be arranged within 2 weeks. She even planned to send invitations to the baptism to Dan and his family. The fourth part of the plan was to enroll the boys in Christian camps for the summer. And fifth, Wendi would register them for toddler classes at the Catholic Church. Donna told Wendi to take control away from Dan by getting to him psychologically. The primary goal of her plan was to make Dan angry. She wanted him to realize that he could lose control over his kids if he refused to cooperate with what Wendi and her family wanted. So to me, this is just above and beyond. It's crazy. I mean, even Wendi declined to go along with this. She explained to her mother that that would just make them look terrible in court. But Donna tried to frighten Wendi over the prospect that Dan would transform her boys into 2 little Orthodox young men. Donna told Wendi that she and Harvey planned to retain another lawyer and make a financial offer to Dan to persuade him to allow for Wendi's relocation. This offer was for $1 million with the cost split between Donna and Harvey, Charlie, and Wendi. Donna also pushed back against something that Wendi had told her, that a divorce really isn't about winning and losing. But Donna said it is about winning and losing, and we're going to get a win here. She suggested to Wendi that her grandmother Lorraine, if she was still alive, would tell her to fight with every bone in her body. So we've got a really heavy influence from Donna here.
Oh, don't we?
Kind of crazy.
But then on July 30th, in mediation, Wendi and Dan managed to reach a compromise. Dan agreed for Wendi to be the primary custodian during the school year for 3 years, and his visitation limited to 6 out of every 14 nights. Summers were to be divided 50-50. Dan agreed to alternate Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Passover with Wendi every other year. Wendi agreed to forego alimony, but Dan would pay child support. The house went to Dan in exchange for him paying Wendi $120,000, and he also agreed to pay $10,000 for Wendi's attorney's fees. The judge, pleased that they had been able to avoid a trial, signed the final divorce judgment. And that evening, Dan sent an email to his friends, subject line, "Feeling better," in which he shared the good news.
Yeah, so it seemed good, but it really wasn't long before Dan and Wendi were back in court. Dan raised the issue of one-on-one time, which he believed his sons should have with each parent. Although this had been recommended by their family therapist, it wasn't included in their parenting agreement. Dan also expressed concern that Wendi was making unilateral decisions about the children, like signing them up for soccer without talking to him. She also was refusing to communicate with him about some important parenting issues like potty training or what they ate.
And there was a matter of urgent importance regarding his mother-in-law, Donna. In addition, on separate occasions, Dan wrote that the boys told him, "Grandma says you're stupid. Grandma says she hates you." Dan expressed concern that continued exposure to such negativity forms the foundation for parental alienation.
Well, for sure. I mean, that's horrible. She doesn't think she's hurting these kids by saying that? It's so selfish and disgusting. And this was exacerbated by the fact that Wendi would often leave the boys alone with their parents, even though that was in violation of his court-ordered right of first refusal, which means whenever she couldn't watch the kids, she was supposed to give him the first chance to take care of them.
She asked him first. Yeah.
But she didn't. She left the kids with her parents instead. So among Dan's requests for relief, he asked the judge to prohibit Wendi from allowing her mother to have unsupervised time with the children. And you can imagine what Donna thought about this.
Yes.
And the back and forth just continued when Wendi went ahead and entered a lottery for kindergarten for their son without talking to Dan.
July 18th, 2014 began as an ordinary summer morning for Dan. He woke the boys up, fed them breakfast, and helped them get ready. He drove them to Creative Preschool, where he dropped them off at 8:50 in the morning. Then on his way to the gym, Dan phoned Wendi. His call went to voicemail, and he said in his message that he is taking an exercise class and expected to be done between 10:15 and 10:30, and they could talk after that. So Dan pulled into the parking lot at Premier Health and Fitness at 9:12 in the morning. When the class ended, Dan walked straight to his car, where he went through his texts on his iPhone. Dan exited the parking lot at 10:38 in the morning, and 10 minutes later, while driving southbound on Thomas Hill Road, he called a friend. Dan told his friend about how Wendy's lottery application for a kindergarten for their older son had been completed without his consent, letting him know that he and his ex-wife didn't agree on very much. From his end of the conversation, the friend eventually heard the ambient road noise fade away, as if Dan had arrived at home. Then, hold on a second, Dan said. There's someone in my driveway that's unfamiliar to me. Sure, no problem, the friend replied, and he waited for Dan to come back on the line, but suddenly he heard a loud noise, followed by muffled groaning. The only thing after that the friend could make out was the sound of heaving breaths, as if Dan's mouth was pressed up against the phone and he was gasping for air. He was afraid Dan was having a heart attack. Dan wasn't responding, so he hung up and tried calling back, and this call went straight to voicemail. Then he texted Dan asking, "Are you okay?" Still no reply.
So at that time, Dan's next-door neighbor, Jim Geiger, was standing beside Dan's car looking through the shattered driver's side window at Dan's blood-covered head. So Jim Geiger had called 911 asking for help.
911, what's the address of your emergency location? Okay, and the phone number you're calling from?
I'm calling.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened.
We heard it looked in, the garage door was up, and I thought the gentleman was backing out, and I went back to my house, but he never backed out, and I came back over, and his driver's side window is shattered, and he's battered and can't answer. He's inside. I don't know if somebody tried to shoot him, or if he shot himself, or what, I don't know.
And was at this location, correct?
He didn't send an ambulance in a hurry. He didn't kill me. He's still alive. He's moving.
Okay, what's going on with him?
I don't know. The driver's side window is all bashed in, and he's got blood all over his head. He's not responding to me.
So as you can see, there was a little bit of confusion there with the 911 operator, which seemed to delay any help getting to Dan. Although we'll find out that there was really no saving Dan.
Tallahassee Police Sergeant Sims was the first officer to arrive at Dan Markel's house. Neighbor Jim Geiger was standing in the street waving his arms. When Sims went into the garage, he found Dan's black Honda Accord still running. Dan was slumped forward in the driver's seat, breathing irregularly. His left hand was still holding his iPhone. His face and shirt were covered in blood. The sergeant entered the car through the passenger side, and he saw a white towel on the front passenger seat with blood on it. Dan's wallet, with $68 in cash and credit cards, was in the glove compartment. His laptop computer was found in a computer bag in the back seat. And after more investigators arrived, Dan was rushed to the hospital. Police used Dan's keys to enter the house, and they searched the house thoroughly and found no evidence of a break-in. Dan's parents in Canada were contacted. They got on the earliest flight they could find to Florida. Wendi was contacted as the mother of Dan's children. She was at lunch with a friend when the police called, and at the police station, Wendi was told that Dan had been shot, and he was taken to the hospital, but was not expected to survive. She appeared to be upset. She sat with the police for hours and seemed cooperative. She said that Dan had given her a lot of grief, but she would never do anything like that. She did talk about how her family didn't like Dan, but she said she didn't believe that they could be behind Dan's murder. She did mention that her brother Charlie had joked on more than one occasion that he had bought Wendi a TV as a divorce gift because it was less expensive than hiring a hitman.
Well, Wendi told the police that Dan had been emotionally abusive, but that she had not shared that information with anyone else. It was odd to the investigator interviewing Wendi when she never asked if her children were okay, because she didn't know what time Dan had been shot and the children had been in his custody. Now, police interviewed Jeffrey Lacasse, who had recently had a breakup with Wendi. He had been seeing her for months, and of course he didn't like Dan because everything he'd heard about Dan he got from Wendi.
Right.
But he did have an ironclad alibi. He had been away on a trip. According to Lacasse, he had overheard the Adelson family talking about how much they hated Dan and how desperately they wanted Wendi and the boys to move to southern Florida. He actually said that hating Dan Markel was the family's favorite hobby. Dan died in the hospital the next day after never regaining consciousness. His parents had not arrived in time to be there with him either. At the hospital, a forensic specialist who would later swab and photograph Wendi Adelson had documented Dan's injuries. There were 2 bullet wounds to his face. The first was just by his left eye by the bridge of his nose. The second was on his left cheek. During the autopsy the next morning, the medical examiner, Dr. Anthony Clark, removed 2 .38 caliber bullets from Dan's head, and he concluded that both had been fired from a distance of 1.5 to 2 feet from Dan's face. The medical examiner was sure that Dan was still conscious after being hit by the first bullet, and that he had raised his left arm when the bullet and glass fragments hit his face. In Dr. Clark's opinion, the wounds from the first gunshot were not fatal. The second bullet, which went through Dan's face, had traveled through his brain and was lodged in the back portion of his skull. This wound caused severe bleeding, and it was the hemorrhaging of that wound that killed Dan.
Neighbor Jim Geiger reported to police that he had seen what looked like a light-colored Prius speeding away from Dan's driveway moments after hearing 2 gunshots. The team of investigators spent weeks looking for the vehicle. Their first big break occurred at Dan's gym, which had security camera surveillance footage from inside and outside the building on the morning of the murder. Now, not only did investigators find video footage of Dan walking through the gym's front door at 9:13 a.m. and leaving at 10:34 a.m., but they also found footage from the parking lot as well. And the parking lot cameras showed Dan's Accord entering the lot and pulling into a parking space at 9:12 a.m. Then just moments later, a greenish-silver Prius pulled into the parking lot and was driving around in circles. The Prius moved to 2 different parking spaces during the 81 minutes Dan was inside the gym, but no one ever got out of or entered the car. And it had tinted windows, so you couldn't see who or what was inside. And after Dan completed his workout and came out of the gym's front doors, outdoor cameras show his car leaving the parking lot at 10:38 with the greenish-silver Prius following him.
Yeah, the gym's camera footage took investigators only so far, because the image of the Prius was too blurry to read its license plate. Investigators collected more security camera footage from businesses along Thomasville Road, between Premier Fitness and Benton Hills. The same Prius showed up in footage from a convenience store and a gas station, but still no images were clear enough to provide more details. Footage from a bank on Thomasville Road did show Dan's Accord traveling westbound on Benton Road just after 8:30 a.m., with the Prius following directly behind it. Now that would have been just after Dan had left home to drive his boys to Creative Preschool, where he dropped them off at 8:50. Thanks to this new footage, investigators knew that Dan's shooter had been stalking him for 2.5 hours that morning. So on July 23rd, the Tallahassee Police Department released an image of the Prius, and this was published by the local newspaper, the Tallahassee Democrat. It was also shown on the TV news. Investigators were hoping someone would recognize the car and provide more details, but unfortunately, no one came forward.
Well, then one investigator named Greg Wilder came up with the idea to check the surveillance cameras on city buses. Tallahassee buses used surveillance cameras, not only inside the bus but outside. So Wilder got footage from 2 buses that operated along Thomasville Road between 10:30 and 11 o'clock in the morning on the day that Dan was shot. Bus 505 ran southbound during that time frame, and Bus 707 ran northbound. So at 10:44 in the morning, a camera at the front of Bus 505 showed both Dan's Accord and the Prius heading south on Thomasville Road between Premier Fitness and Benton Hills. At 10:47 in the morning, the bus pulled up behind the Prius, which had stopped at a traffic light. The Florida license plate on the back of the Prius was visible, but not clear enough to read. And once the traffic light turned green, the Prius sped away. Though Bus 505 lost track of the Prius for a minute or two, at 10:51 in the morning, the Prius came back into view and turned left on a Benton Road in the direction of Dan's home street, Trescott Drive. Less than 4 minutes later, Dan was shot in his garage.
Footage captured by Bus 707 was even more helpful. At 10:55, while stopped at a traffic light, the bus's rear security camera showed the Prius, now driving north after Dan had been shot, speeding. The Prius had to stop for a red light, and as it pulled up beside Bus 707, the security camera on the bus's left side captured some movement from the Prius's passenger seat. Slowing the video's speed, they could see that a person wearing a white shirt was sitting in the seat. Investigators really couldn't make out who was in the car, but now they knew at least that there were 2 people involved in Dan's murder, a driver and a passenger. With this video footage and some information from Toyota, investigators were able to conclude that Toyota had manufactured this Prius model between 2006 and 2009, and that the paint color was called Silver Pine Mica. The Prius was missing a front tow hook cover too, and an aftermarket black casing was on the passenger side mirror. Also, the Prius had a SunPass transponder for paying tolls, and this differentiated this car from other Priuses.
Another group of investigators canvassed Dan's neighborhood, asking Dan's neighbors if they had seen or heard anything. A resident of the nearby Ashford Club Apartments gave them some information. She told investigators that at mid-morning, Thursday, July 17th, a bluish-silver Prius-like car parked in the apartment parking lot. 2 men, she said, got out of the car and walked down a path along a storm drainage ditch. On the other side of the ditch, there was a chain-link fence at the rear of Dan Markel's property. The apartment resident told investigators that the car's driver was a light-skinned, tall man who was wearing a light-colored baseball hat. The passenger, she said, was shorter, with a darker complexion, maybe Hispanic or Italian, and he had short dark hair. After they left her view, the 2 men came back about 10 minutes later. She noticed that the shorter man was holding something black in his hand, and he was wet, apparently from having fallen into the ditch. She also noticed that the taller man's pants were wet up to his knees. So if the resident's memory was correct, the occupants of the Prius that pulled up beside Bus 707 just after the shooting were 2 men who had been in Tallahassee the day before the murder, staking out the eventual crime scene.
And that would turn out to be true.
They got him.
Yeah, well, not quite, but we're getting there. Sorta. Now, Wendy's parents, Harvey and Donna, spoke to the lead investigator at Dan's memorial service, which was held on July 20th. They agreed to contact the police to arrange an interview before they returned home to South Florida. The next day, an investigator called Wendi on her cell. Once he identified himself, Wendi claimed to have a bad connection, and the call ended abruptly. Less than 5 minutes later, Wendy's attorney called the investigator at the same phone number and told him that Wendi had left town with her children and her parents, and they were on their way to South Florida. Harvey, Donna, and Wendi had left Tallahassee the day after Dan's memorial service, without even speaking to the investigator as they'd agreed to. After leaving, no one in the Adelson family made any contact with the police regarding Dan's murder investigation. Another thing that police would find suspicious about Wendi was that she would change her sons' last names from Markel to Adelson within a year of the murder. She would also get rid of a middle name of one of the children that was very important to Dan, a family name. Also, her oldest brother Charlie Adelson, the one who worked at the dental office in South Florida, didn't attend the service for Dan at all. So after that Sunday memorial service for Dan was over, investigators were approached by a woman, and her name was Tamara Demko. She said that she and Dan had gone to Harvard Law School together and that she'd been good friends with him ever since. Despite the divorce, she was still friendly with Wendi, and in a police interview, she said that the divorce between Dan and Wendi was the nastiest one she'd ever seen, with the two especially fighting over Wendy's attempted relocation to South Florida. She said that Dan had won that battle, forcing Wendi to stay in Tallahassee against her will. And she added that Dan had recently discovered that Wendi had hidden some assets from him during their divorce settlement, and that he was planning on seeking sanctions from her. Demko believed that Wendy's parents had been overly involved in this divorce and were pushing their daughter to get everything she could from Dan because he owed her for their failed marriage. She talked about an interaction with Harvey and Donna Adelson at Wendy's house the day before Dan's funeral, when she had gone to pay her respects. Even though she'd met Wendy's parents several times before, she said that something seemed off about them that day. Harvey seemed uncomfortable and unable to look her in the eye. And Demko said that she was also very suspicious of Wendy's brother Charlie, who definitely hated Dan and was very protective of his sister.
So a theme that was touched upon in every interview with the police was the nasty divorce between Wendi and Dan, and her parents' over-involvement in the case and hatred of Dan. So investigators believe that the key to solving Dan's murder was to delve further into the divorce. Now, looking through the papers, it was obvious that Wendi and her parents were disappointed that she and the boys couldn't move to South Florida.
I think disappointed is putting it lightly.
I think incensed.
I think especially Donna was obsessed with this.
Yes. FBI agents visited Wendy's oldest brother, Rob, in Albany, New York, who told them that he wasn't close with either of his siblings. Charlie hated Dan, Rob said, and had adequate financial resources to hire a hitman.
So that's something to say about your brother, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, he's got enough money, he could have done it. He described his younger brother as cold in the way he talked about people and flashy with money, cars, boats, and guns.
Yeah, so that fall, investigators came across some really vicious emails that Donna had written Wendi during the divorce, which had come from a laptop computer Wendi had voluntarily handed over to the police on the evening that Dan was shot. Those emails made it clear that Donna and Harvey Adelson had been really enraged by their ex-son-in-law, and they were considering some extreme measures to get what they wanted. Investigators also found other interesting items in Wendy's computer. She'd recently done Google searches about Dan's girlfriend, Amy Adler, Amy Adler's ex-husband, and her brother. They also learned that Wendi had been listed as the primary beneficiary on Dan's life insurance policy, which would pay out $2 million.
Yeah, more motive.
Yeah, so search warrants were issued for the cell phone records for Wendi, Donna, Harvey, and Charlie Adelson. If whoever was in the Prius communicated with one or more of the Adelsons in the weeks leading up to the murder, those records could reveal it. They took the phone numbers listed in the 4 Adelson cell phone records and compared them to any phone numbers that connected with cell towers near the preschool, the gym, or Dan's house on the morning of his murder. And that strategy worked. There was one telephone number that appeared in both the cell tower records and the Adelsons' cell phone records. On July 1st, 2014, 17 days before the murder, that number had connected with Harvey Adelson's cell phone. That same number had pinged a T-Mobile tower near Premier Fitness at 9:36 a.m. and 9:58 a.m. on July 18th. The number belonged to T-Mobile subscriber Sigfredo Garcia, who had an address, guess where? Miami Beach. And of course, this was just a short drive from Donna and Harvey Adelsons' home. So a search warrant for Garcia's T-Mobile records showed one of Garcia's most frequently called numbers had pinged an AT&T cell tower near Dan's gym while he was working out on the morning of the shooting, and a tower near Benton Hills the day before. That phone number was owned by Luis Manuel Rivera, another Miami Beach resident. Now, Rivera and Garcia were a perfect match to the description provided by the woman from the apartment complex. SunPass records from the toll plazas showed that only one Toyota Prius had made a round trip between southern Florida and Tallahassee between July 16th and July 18th. They used the SunPass transponder number associated with that Prius to identify a small car rental company located in North Miami, Hybrid Auto Rentals. The company's July 15th rental agreement for the Prius was completed in the name of Luis Rivera. The contact number Rivera supplied matched his AT&T account as well. And on the top left corner of the rental agreement, there was a second telephone number. Guess whose? Sigfredo Garcia's. So they'd rented the car in their own names. And the agreement stated that the Prius was to be returned on July 17th, but it wasn't actually brought back until July 21st.
Well, that's pretty smart of these guys, isn't it?
No, well, we never said that murderers were smart.
Investigators found out that the two hitmen had stayed at a budget inn near Florida State's campus. They had checked in about 1 a.m. on July 17th. And though he didn't give the motel his correct phone number, Rivera had registered at the front desk in his own name and said that there would be 2 people staying there. So with the rental agreement for the Prius, the GPS data, and hotel registration, investigators were pretty convinced that they'd identified Dan Markel's killers.
Oh, sure.
Looking like, huh?
Absolutely. Now, investigators still had a lot to look into, including the motive, and if there was any connection between the killers and the Adelsons. So, by 2016, investigators were able to put together some information supporting their theory that Catherine Manbagua, a former girlfriend of Charlie Adelson, had conspired with Sigfredo Garcia, the father of her children, and Luis Rivera, a friend of Garcia's, to drive from Miami to Tallahassee to kill Dan. They had the car rental receipts, the cell records, and the video surveillance, putting Garcia and Rivera at the scene of the crime.
And investigators learned that after the murder, Manbagua received $13,000 in payments by Adelson business checks and over $56,000 in cash payments from unknown sources. They believed that this money was received by Manbagua for being the go-between between the Adelsons and the killers, Garcia and Rivera.
Well, that makes sense. Now, Garcia's phone records showed about 2,700 connections between his phone and a 786 number between May 1st, 2014 and July 19th, 2014. And the owner of that 786 number was Catherine Manbagua. A search of vital records revealed that she was the mother of a boy and a girl with Sigfredo Garcia listed on their birth certificates as their father. Although there was no public record of a marriage between Catherine and Garcia, she used his surname Garcia as her last name on her Facebook and her Gmail accounts. Another breakthrough came when Charlie Adelson's call records were reviewed, and Manbagua's 786 number showed up more than 900 times in his records between early May and mid-July 2014. The two had actually been dating during that time.
And following the homicide, both Garcia and Rivera bought several different vehicles. They posted photos of themselves with cars and motorcycles on Facebook in August of 2014. And investigators also learned that Manbagua was driving a Lexus, which was registered to Harvey Adelson. In January of 2016, the title was transferred to Manbagua, and she got a new license plate. The DMV record showed that she had purchased the car for $1,700. Her bank records showed no withdrawal of $1,700. And that was a pretty good deal for a Lexus.
Sure was.
Because the minimum retail value is around $6,000.
So this is great evidence.
It is. Like we say a lot of times, it's all circumstantial, but it's really good circumstantial.
Oh yeah, it's very convincing. Garcia, Rivera, and Catherine Magbanua were charged in Dan Markel's murder. Rivera pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. He actually told detectives that Garcia had asked him to drive him to Tallahassee to kill Dan Markel. He knew that Catherine Magbanua was the go-between for a woman who wanted full custody of her children. So, Wendi Adelson? Yeah. So he had implicated the Adelsons as well as Catherine Magbanua and Garcia.
So Sigfredo Garcia was found guilty of first-degree murder following nearly 2 weeks of testimony. Jurors continued deliberating on whether to convict Catherine Magbanua. After struggling and failing to reach a unanimous decision, they officially deadlocked, and the judge declared a mistrial. But we're not done with her. So after repeated delays due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Catherine Magbanua was retried in May 2022. Wendi Adelson was listed as a material witness for the state, but 6 weeks before the trial, Wendi filed for a protective order stating that she would be asserting her Fifth Amendment privilege. She agreed to testify at the trial, however, if she was subpoenaed and granted immunity for her testimony. So nothing she said as a witness could be used against her in any possible future charges for her ex-husband's murder.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean she could never be charged. It just means they couldn't use what she said at this trial in any charges against her. So she's not free and clear.
No.
Now, Luis Rivera was a prosecution witness in Catherine Magbanua's trial. He said that he was paid in cash and that the bills had been stapled together. Then an ex-girlfriend of Charlie Adelson testified that he kept large amounts of cash stapled in a home safe. So more circumstantial, right? So on May 27, 2022, Catherine Magbanua was convicted of first-degree murder and solicitation to commit murder. She did take the stand in her own defense, but she didn't implicate the Adelsons at all. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years for the conspiracy and an additional 30 years for solicitation. So her life is basically over.
I guess she's not going anyplace.
But it's interesting that she didn't turn in any of the Adelsons. Because we know that has to be the connection. She had no motive. Those two men had no motive. Only the Adelsons did.
No, and her connection with the Adelsons is that she was dating Charlie.
Yeah, right.
So.
And a lot of communications and the Lexus, there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. I would maybe not exactly believe, but I'd be more thinking of looking at Charlie than at Wendi.
Yes, but then do you think Charlie would do it without Wendy's consent?
Well, that gets to the second part of it.
Right.
Is that she's involved up to her neck also.
I think they all are, yes.
Yeah, I don't know about Harvey, although he was funding things, but
Harvey knew, I think, yeah.
He probably knew.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly Donna knew.
Oh, I think Donna was the instigator in many ways. She seemed the one that was most upset about the children not living near her. And by the time Magbanua was convicted, Charlie Adelson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. For years, prosecutors had access to a video recorded by an undercover FBI agent that showed a meeting between Charlie Adelson and Catherine Magbanua at a Miami Beach restaurant called Dolce Vita in 2016. So they really couldn't hear it very well, but new audio enhancement clarified what was said that day. The video shows Adelson and Magbanua discussing a potential blackmail situation for more than 40 minutes, and this tape was recorded by an undercover FBI agent. But investigators worked for years to decipher this audio.
But they finally did.
They did.
So also, back in 2016, Donna Adelson was walking on her way to the elementary school across the street to pick up her 5- and 6-year-old grandsons. Remember, after Dan's murder, Wendi and the kids had moved close to Wendi's parents.
Well, yeah.
So they got what they had wanted all along.
That's a suspicious thing, sure.
Yeah, but then out of nowhere, a middle-aged white man approached Donna and stopped her. The stranger called out to her, "Excuse me, Mrs. Adelson," in a somewhat friendly tone. "I just want to give you this." He's holding a piece of paper which he put in her hand. "Who are you?" Donna asked. "You're scaring me." "No, don't be scared," the stranger said, chuckling. "Listen, just want to let you know that we know that your family has been taking care of Katie and her friend Tuto," that's Garcia's nickname, "for quite some time, after your problem up north was resolved." So Tutu's one nickname, Tato, was Rivera.
Yeah, Tuto is Garcia, Tato is Rivera.
Tuto, Tato.
Yeah. So he said, "I want to let you know that my brother's incarcerated. He helped your family with a problem you guys had up north, and we want to make sure that he's going through some rough times, and we want to make sure that you take care of what he's going through, the way you're taking care of Katie and Tuto." "I don't know what you're talking about," Donna said, and she stared at the man with this confused look on her face. "Well, this will explain it," he said, and he handed her the paper and thanked her. Then he turned around and began walking down the sidewalk. Donna walked behind him, and when she got to the corner, she put the paper into her purse, crossed the street, and walked to the school. Now, what Donna didn't know was that this man was an undercover FBI agent. Additional FBI agents and the Miami Beach police were also in the van across the street, and they were videotaping this entire interaction. The interaction between Donna and the undercover agent was what investigators would call a bump. So this is a strategy for an undercover agent to deliberately rattle someone who's suspected of a crime, hopefully causing the suspect to engage in some incriminating behavior or communication. So the sheet of paper the agent had handed to Donna was a printout of a July 21st, 2015 article from a weekly newspaper, the Miami New Times, which was marking the 1-year anniversary of Dan Markel's murder. An enlarged color photo of Dan's smiling face was beneath the headline, and written in handwriting on the printout was a telephone number, as well as the figure $5,000. Investigators wanted Donna and her son to believe that someone close to Luis Rivera was trying to blackmail them. The sheet of paper was an implied threat that Donna and Charlie would be reported to the police unless they paid the $5,000. So once she got home, Donna called the number on the paper, and she told the guy that she's all stressed out because she doesn't know his friend who's in jail. But the agent told her to quit fucking around and get the $5,000 to him. So she told him she'd call him back, and she hung up. Then Donna called her son Charlie, and they had a really cryptic conversation. She told him that she had some paperwork delivered to her, but she wouldn't say what it was. She wanted to get together and talk with Charlie in person.
So Charlie called up Catherine Magbanua, and he told her to find out who the man is and tell him to stop playing games. And Magbanua told Charlie that it was probably someone just trying to upset them, basically. And it's almost funny, but she even suggested it could be the FBI.
See, she's not so stupid.
And they each threatened to go to the police, but then the subject was dropped and there was no more discussion about it. Then Charlie called the phone number that Donna gave him. He didn't know that he was actually calling an FBI agent, so let's have a listen to this conversation.
Hello? Hola, diga. Hello? Diga. Who's this? Who's this? Someone's been calling my family and trying to figure out who this is. In reference to what, man? Someone by the name of Sammy called? Yeah, that's me, man. Alright, what's going on? Well, what's going on is my brother Tato. Okay, my brother Tato has not been taken care of. His family's not been taken care of. I talked to a dentist. Why are you calling me? Who are you?
I gave the number to a lady.
I don't know Tato.
You don't know Tato? I'm sure you know Katie and Tuto. They've been taken care of since the family problem been taken care of up north.
I don't know who you are.
You don't? Well, this is going away, my friend. Because let me tell you something. I was at Broward with Tato, and he told me the whole story. He told me nobody was taking care of him. Nobody was taking care of his family. The family was taking care of Katie and Tuto, and nothing's been taken care of with Tato. So we know what's going on. And Tato needs to be taken care of. Do the right thing. The lady already has the paperwork. She knows what I'm talking about. We know Katie. We know Tuto. We know they've been taken care of.
Let me look at it.
No more f***ing around, man. No more f***ing around. This ain't going away. You guys need to do the right thing for Tato. That's my brother, man. That's my brother, and he needs to be taken care of. His family needs to be taken care of, just like Katie and Tuto have been taken care of.
I've never met these people, but let me call you back, okay?
That's bullshit, man. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You know this lady. I don't know your relationship with this lady, but we know what the f*** is going on. This ain't going away. Take care of Tato just like you take care of Katie and Tuto, man.
Let me call you back.
So I just don't feel like an innocent person would call that number and be concerned about it, right?
Well, that's the first thing. If I've had this conversation and I'm told to call this number or given this number, I'm not going to call them because I don't have anything to do with it.
Right, you'd take it to the police.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine.
So the FBI did get some suspicious conversations, but there wasn't any confession by any means.
No.
Was there?
No, not at all.
So the case against Charlie kind of stalled until 2022. They didn't have enough evidence at that point to get a conviction.
Right.
But then he was arrested and charged in April 2022, and he was denied bond. Prosecutor Georgia Kappelman said that not only was Adelson a flight risk, but he was also a danger to the community, and he could influence or tamper with witnesses in his pending murder trial.
Oh, of course, yes. I would be very afraid he would do something like that. Now, he did plead not guilty.
You have to.
But with the surveillance set up by investigators, a video of Charlie and his father, Harvey, from April 21st, 2016 had been recorded. These two had met at Matsuri restaurant in Miami, and while being recorded by undercover officers, they discuss who the police are likely to talk to about the murder. And Harvey Adelson reveals some kind of an agreement between Charlie and Catherine Magbanua. So Charlie says in the video, they wouldn't want to talk to Wendi, so you're the next to talk to. One or the other, but the woman is usually the weaker choice. You know, the one that's going to give in. So it is what it is. And Harvey replies, that's what Katie agreed with you? Charlie says, yes, that's where you're at. The thing is, I actually think at some point somebody had to reach out, had to do something, so there has to be some kind of tactic to come into. Then the video ends shortly after Charlie says, I think there's a recorder in that bag. Oh boy.
Too late.
Yep. So Charlie's been held in solitary confinement since his arrest as a security measure because of the high-profile publicity surrounding Dan's murder. His trial's been pushed off until at least September of 2023 because his defense attorney said that they need more time to prepare. The judge also has granted the motion to restrict the release of interviews and other materials that the state has with Catherine Magbanua after her trial ended. So there could be some interesting stuff coming out.
Sounds like it. So we don't know if Wendi, Donna, or Harvey will ever be charged in Dan's murder. But after going over the case and reading 2 books about it, we believe that Wendi had prior knowledge of the murder and was actually in on it with her family.
Absolutely. Now, like we said, small circumstantial things, but there's so many of them. And I just want to go over them if you don't mind.
No.
So the first one, of course, is that Wendi wanted out of Tallahassee. She told everyone who would listen about that. It was her main thing with her and her mother, right?
Yes, it was.
So that's a strong motive. Then in the month of June, according to her ex-boyfriend, Jeffrey Lacasse, Wendi would have frequent bouts of crying for reasons that she couldn't explain to him, and this was a new behavior. So I think what we can take from this is maybe she knew that this was going to happen and she wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Now, recent court filings and allegations by Dan about Wendi hiding assets before his death during the divorce were going to be a real legal issue for Wendi. She faced possible criminal contempt charges, actually, because Dan had alleged that Wendi took a Markel family heirloom. This was actually an heirloom from one of the family members who had survived the Holocaust, and that she had emptied their safe deposit box of about $500,000 in assets. So if this was found in Dan's favor, Wendi could possibly lose her job and her law license. And Dan had also filed a motion for Wendi's mom, Donna, to only be allowed to see the boys with supervision, and you know that didn't go over well. Also, after the custody was finalized, Wendi returned to court a year later to ask for sole custody and move her sons to South Florida. She was denied this, and the judge actually saw this as a frivolous lawsuit. Now, another really suspicious thing was that Wendi had completed the pre-divorce parenting class months before filing for divorce. And the reason I think this points toward her being involved in Dan being murdered is this whole secrecy that she seemed to be kind of conspiring with her family for a very long time.
So Wendi changed her Facebook profile picture the day before Dan's murder from a mom with 2 kids photo to a photo of a professional-looking single woman.
The day before his murder.
Day before.
Yes. And weeks before Dan's murder, Wendi told her boyfriend Jeff Lacasse that she was trapped in Tallahassee, and her only way out was if something happened to Dan. Now, I really think she was trying to frame Lacasse for Dan's murder.
Yeah, Wendi kept pressing Lacasse for the exact time when he would be leaving Tallahassee on the Friday Dan was murdered. Now, this was after she had broken up with him, and this could have been to coordinate the time of the killing in order to frame Lacasse as the killer. This could have been planned way in advance by Wendi leading him on and then jolting him right before the murder.
Which she did. He was really getting this hot and heavy and then I'm done with you kind of vibe right before the murder.
Say, what's going on here? I thought we were a good couple.
Yeah, now, fortunately, Lacasse had credit card statements that showed he'd made a purchase at a Kmart in Sweetwater, Tennessee at 1:14 p.m. on the day of Dan's murder. That's about 2 hours after the shooting. But Wendi had known he was leaving town that day, and, she could have made it look like he was fleeing the murder scene.
Yeah, timing didn't work out though, did it?
No.
Now, just 5 days before the murder, Wendi had told Lacasse about her brother Charlie's plot to kill Dan back in 2013. She said that Charlie had explored all the options to take care of the problem and had even mentioned an amount, how much it was going to cost.
Right.
Lacasse also said that Wendi is deceptive. She's just not very good about it. If you watch her testimony in the Catherine Magbanua trial, she did lie many times.
Yeah, and her behavior was just so inappropriate. She giggled. It was disturbing, really. Now, we know that Wendi hated Tallahassee so much that the family was willing to offer $1 million to Dan if he would move to Miami. Hiring a hitman, though, was $100,000, so that was actually a bargain for them, cheaper for them to kill him, although they knew Dan was never going to take a bribe or a blackmail.
Oh, probably not.
No. But also, Wendi invoked the Fifth Amendment many times in her deposition, so that shows the focus that she had was to save herself, and she never showed any interest in finding Dan's killers. Remember how she plotted with her parents to file for divorce and take the kids and the belongings from the house while Dan was in New York? To me, that just shows so much calculation and a complete lack of respect or love for Dan, or even considering his relationship with his sons. Another thing that had bothered Wendi was Dan's strict Jewish lifestyle. And by having Dan murdered, the Adelsons didn't have to worry about that anymore. They weren't going to be in this cult, as the Adelsons called it.
The other Adelson family members would not have gone ahead and planned the hit without Wendi's knowledge.
I can't imagine that they would.
And just as a by the way, it was Wendi who knew where Dan would be on the morning he was killed.
Absolutely. Now, also, the hitmen rented a car that was nearly identical to Jeff Lacasse's car. So that also points to her trying to frame that boyfriend.
Now, here's a big one. Wendi drove up to the crime scene tape a few houses from Dan's about an hour after he had been shot. And she would claim that she drove to the old neighborhood to come to terms with her divorce.
Psh, come to terms with it? She was more than happy to be divorced.
She may have been impatient because the hitman had not yet called her to say that the hit was done yet.
I could see that. Also, she had told the police she'd gone to a liquor store that was far away to get this Bullet Rye bourbon, even though there were several liquor stores close to where she lived and where she was having her lunch date. And when Wendi saw that crime scene tape when she drove over there, she never asked about the safety of her sons or Dan. She never said anything, even though there were police cruisers there. And when the police came to her lunch date after the shooting, Wendi went with them in the police cruiser to the police station and never once asked, "What is this about? Are my kids okay?" Nothing.
Then days after Dan's murder, Wendi switched to a new phone because she thought it was bugged by police. She also called Dan's life insurance company just one day after the murder.
Well, Wendi then kept her boys away from the entire Markel family for the past 9 years. And the only way that Dan's parents got to see their grandchildren was after a new law was passed, the Markel Act, in 2022. So she was definitely trying to erase the Markels from her children's lives. She changed their name, she moved them away, she got rid of that family name, and she kept them from their grandparents, Dan's parents. Plus there was the money, right? She got money from the university. She got $2,400 per month per child in Social Security benefits and $2 million total by the time her sons reached age 18 as a result of Dan's death.
It's a fair amount of money.
A lot of money. So I just think it'll be so interesting to watch Charlie Adelson's trial this fall and see if anything comes out that will get other family members indicted. Because I just feel like they were all involved in some way. They had to at least know about it.
Now, are Dan's parents still alive?
I think so, yeah.
Any mention of a civil suit by them?
That's a good question, Dickie. I haven't heard anything about it. That would be something to look into for sure.
Well, I would think for sure they'd want to do that, unless they're waiting to see the outcome of Charlie's trial.
They might be, and I don't know if the Adelsons are having as much money as they used to. Of course, Charlie's not practicing anymore, and I believe Harvey's retired.
Well, so who's running the practice?
Yeah, good question. I don't know if the practice is still owned by them, actually, because Charlie's been held in jail for a long time now, and I don't imagine you keep your license to practice if you get convicted of murder.
I think not.
No.
But, it's tough to practice anyway if you're in prison.
Yeah, that's true. But I think even if he was out on bond, it would be shaky.
Oh, yeah.
How many people would want to go to him? I mean, this is a case that has so much publicity. I'm sure most of our listeners have heard of the case, but just all the detail of it is
positive.
Fascinating.
We've seen at least a couple documentaries on the case.
Yep, and there's a whole podcast on it as well,
Yeah.
several episodes. So yeah, it's just a really fascinating case.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. So we'll keep an eye on it and keep our listeners updated, or if our listeners have any information that we missed, we'd love to hear from you about it as well. So I think what we're going to do is forego our feedback and save it for next time because we've been talking for a very long time.
And you're probably bored.
No.
You're looking at your watch and you're saying, is this going to end pretty soon? Because I want to go to sleep.
Well, I think you just fall asleep while you're listening and you pick it up the next day. That's what I do.
Okay.
Okay, so before we go, I just want to remind everyone that you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com with case suggestions or any comments. And you can leave us a voicemail from your phone or computer or any device by clicking on the link in our show notes or going to our website, tiegrabber.com, and clicking on Leave a Voicemail. You can also help us out if you would leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is that you listen to us. And one more reminder, we have an option for listeners to get ad-free versions of our episodes and get access to our members-only ad-free bonus episodes. And you can look into that at tiegrabber.com/subscribe. You can also do it on Patreon if that's easier for you by going to patreon.com/tiegrabber. Whatever way you find to support us, listening, subscribing, leaving us a review, anything, we do appreciate you. And we thank you for joining us here at The Quiet End.
We're glad you're here.
Absolutely. So we'll see you next time at The Quiet End.
Got a couple seats down here. Come on and see us.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.